Oh, hello guys, GatorGamer jumping into another Hello guys, GatorGamer jumping into another video, and today we are back to reacting to Matthew Sent Oreo. And today we are reacting to 5 scariest creepypastas to keep you up at night. You have to have something scarier than that to keep me up at night.
Uncle Matt's back to tell you a bedtime story.
Bedtime story?
If you're easily scared, you may want to turn away now. Okay, let's begin. They say that there's a kernel of truth in every story. Every story has something that inspired it, a real-life event that grew into a story that perhaps even the author did not expect it to become. And oftentimes these stories are born from horrible events. Events that were devastating and traumatic to the author. Maybe these stories were a way for them to communicate their pain under the guise of a fictional story. Or perhaps they just want the reader to feel the same fear that they did on that faithful day.
Yeah, sounds reasonable.
Here are the 5 scariest creepypastas that will keep you up at night.
Play it on.
Number 5 is I Found a Letter from My Stalker.
Bring it on, Creepypasta.
Written under the pseudonym Minister of Owls, the author tells a story of a note that they found on their lawn the day of their birthday that they just can't describe. The note begins by an anonymous writer describing Minister in detail. Her eyes, her skin, and how much she's changed since they first met. This person knew Minister from school. In fact, they claimed that they were close. But things turn unsettling when the writer describes...
Hold up a second. I need a moment to clean off my screen. Here we go.
Changed
now I can
since
see
they
much
first
better.
met. This person knew Minister from school. In fact, they claimed that they were close. But things turn unsettling when the writer describes Minister as a ghost, how nobody else saw her except him. How day in and day out they would talk, but that the moment he left the classroom, he would forget her until the next day, when she would desperately try to remind him of who she was. To Minister, this was bizarre, and she thought this person to be crazy, but then she kept reading. He explained how she was inexplicably covered in fireflies and that he knew everything about her, but he still didn't remember her. In an effort to break the cycle,
Evelyn,
he carved
but a little
her
bit
name
glowy.
into his arm with a pair of scissors. And it worked. He remembered her the next day and every day onward. In an effort to become closer, the two decided to figure out exactly what these fireflies were around her the entire time. Were they a curse? Something else? They had to find out. Upon going through old family tree books, they discovered a picture of 2 siblings, Susie Appleby Regan, aged 13, and Terry Appleby Regan, aged 12. They were surrounded by a cloud of fireflies. That's when they discovered a haunting journal that they'd never forget. The journal belonged to a deranged mental patient named Joey, who claimed to be a serial killer. The journal outlined exactly how he carried out his killings, with disturbing detail. But what was most disturbing was that he was able to summon these fireflies, which would make everyone forget about the victim. Not even the police or their parents would remember them. Nobody. That night the two kissed, but upon doing so, the fireflies shifted. They came onto him and left her, and suddenly she didn't know who he was anymore. She pulled away from him like a stranger and never looked back. As it turns out, he traded places with her. He saved her. The note was his attempt to remind her of who he was and what they had.
Oh, an ad or loading.
Saved her. The note was his attempt to remind her of who he was and what they had. Number 4 is
Crazy.
The Living History Project. Written by Christine O'Neill, she tells the story of being a middle school teacher who is responsible for grading her class's living history assignments. These assignments had the kids sit with their grandparents and videotape or record their oldest memories for posterity. She was used to them after having done these assignments for 17 years in a row, but upon sitting down to grade them in her home, one assignment submitted in the form of a video disc stood out as different. One of her students, Olivia, a normal student, had sat down with her great-uncle Stephen. The room that she was in looked like a hoarder's hell, and she looked somewhat scared. With her mother recording behind the camera, Olivia proceeded to ask her great-uncle Stephen what his oldest memories of being in the army were. After some basic information, he proceeded to explain how his unit was assigned to a school destroyed by the violence of war. That's when he pulled out a piece of paper, a letter, that he had discovered in the basement of that school, along with something else. The letter outlined the thoughts and experiences of a janitor who worked in the school. His wife and daughter had been taken from him due to illness, and in order to stay sane, he simply went back to work as a janitor at the school, and he would listen to his radio all day. It was the only thing that kept his thoughts away. Oddly, none of the teachers or students minded the low-volume radio as it played all day as he would clean the school. Due to a lack of funds, the school paid him in food, which he gladly took from the larder. Except one morning his radio stopped working. He began to panic and tried to fix it. After all, it was the only thing keeping his thoughts of his wife and daughter away. It was literally the only thing keeping him alive. But the thoughts became too much, and he decided that he would take his life that same day. He placed the note outside of the basement door and hung himself. However, the story did not end there. The letter had a date on it. Her uncle had discovered this letter just 2 weeks before this war-torn school was to be rebuilt. It had been completely destroyed for 2 years. The janitor had been going to this school every day, cleaning up blood and rubble like they were drinks and dust. The students and teachers that he saw every day, they were dead bodies left behind from the war 2 years ago. He would clean around the corpses and the ground under them. The man had gone insane after the passing of his wife and daughter and used the school as an escape before one day finally ending it all. Number 3 is He Who Wanders.
He Who Wanders.
Written by Simon Simonian, this story follows a man named Fernandez Agustin Navarro, who has been chased for years by a mysterious entity which he calls He Who Wanders. An admirer of the writer and poet Jorge Luis Borges, Fernandez studied his work closely. One day he had an opportunity to see him give a lecture at a university. While there during the Q&A portion of the lecture, Borges called upon Fernandez, asking if they had met before. Fernandez, upon saying no, was told by Borges that he would meet him again and proceeded to answer questions from the audience. 9 years later, Fernandez recounts how he was now a promising journalist in London. That's when, on one particular day, he saw him, the one who wanders. At first, he was simply someone who caught his eye, perhaps a homeless man or a street hippie. However, things changed when the wanderer began following Fernandez. He began to run, and the wanderer followed. Knowing that there was something different about this man, terror gripped Fernandez as he ran as fast as he possibly could. Upon hiding, finding himself in an uncontrollable panic, he discovered the man was suddenly gone. This was the beginning of the descent into madness for Fernandez. Shortly after, he had another opportunity to see Borges give a new presentation for his new book. Shockingly, but as promised, Borges remembered him and invited him to his hotel for a coffee after the talk. Upon entering later that day, Borges asked Fernandez if he had ever read his book, The Book of Imaginary Beings. Fernandez had, and Borges revealed that there was once a creature that he did not include in it because it was, in fact, real. The One Who Wanders. The real name of this creature was the Quietus Est. He explained that this entity, who he thought may be a demon in the form of a human, has existed for centuries. It's a creature that stalks you, showing you the exact time of your death, counting down the minutes and seconds. After talking well into the morning hours, Fernandez left the hotel, only to immediately feel the presence of the One Who Wanders. It was then that he knew what he must do. He decided that he would run no more. He would finally face this shadow. He ran and hid as he heard the ever-approaching steps of the entity. Gripping a knife that he had with him, Right before the entity approached him, he popped out and swung, making contact with the Wanderer's throat. But the Wanderer did not fight back. Instead, he simply sat down and, having just enough power left to speak, said, "You're confused. You have it all wrong. Let me help you understand." It was then that the entity, now revealed to be an old man, explained to Fernandez that he had followed him his entire life. He explained that he'd been lied to. While sitting, struggling to speak, he explained that he was in fact Fernandez Agustin Navarro, and that the real one who wanders was himself. It turns out that Borges had tricked him into thinking that he was the real Fernandez. "He made you think that you were me," said the old man, "the real Fernandez. That's how he evaded you." Upon hearing this, he who was revealed to be the true wanderer strangled the remaining life from the old man, completing his purpose of being the quietus est, the one who wanders. Number 2 is Distorted Warning Signals. Written by Ashley Rose Wellman, this is the story of a girl who had received unexplained warning calls her entire life. Her first call came up unknown and warned her not to get on a plane that she was about to board. As she did, she ended up in the Starbucks in the food court of the airport, where she watched in horror as every TV in the terminal lit up with crash footage from that flight. There were no survivors. The second time, she was warned not to go on a blind date. 5 months later, she discovered her would-be date was convicted of killing 4 women, all with her same hair color. The third warned her not to drive to the concert tonight. It turned out that an 18-wheeler had lost control and plowed into a line of cars, every driver crushed. After these calls, some time went by without another call, and she had planned a cruise with her friends. One night, she had been out to dinner with a friend and noticed that she had missed a call from an unknown number. That number had left a message, which it had never done before. But thinking about how disappointed that she was that she wouldn't be able to go on that cruise, she returned home. But it was then, upon clicking play message, that her heart dropped. The garbled voice message said, "Do not come home after dinner tonight. Do not come home after dinner tonight. Do not come home after dinner tonight." And number 1 is My Father Punished Me When I Talked to Ghosts. Written by Edwin Crow, this story outlines the author's struggles from birth, from being born blind. The author outlines his childhood from the perspective of being blind, and how he very rarely got guests, of the living kind, that is. Edwin always had the ability to talk to ghosts, but his father didn't like it and told him to stop as it upset him. These ghosts would visit him and speak with him, the first of which was named Ellie. She was very kind, but asked what was wrong with his face. People would sometimes mention his face, but he would always play it off, not understanding what they meant. When asked about Ellie, his father didn't want to talk about her. He was always dodgy in that way. It wasn't until Edwin was older that his father finally explained that their home was connected to another world, and that sometimes dead people would slip through. People who died in pain and who were trying desperately to reach the living. He explained that Edwin could hear them because he couldn't see, but to always ignore them because it was dangerous, and if he did, the dead could attach themselves to Edwin forever. The next ghost was Alex. She said she didn't know where she was and that she needed help, but this time Edwin ignored her as she continued to plead for help. Edwin didn't want to be haunted forever. Eventually, Alex became quiet, and everything remained quiet for a long time. That was until Sarah appeared. She begged him for a way out, that she needed help, but all Edwin said to her was that he couldn't speak with her. "I'm lost, I want to see my daddy," she said. Then she said something truly haunting. "He's dead, your father is dead. Please help me leave." In desperation, Edwin unlocked the front door in an attempt to do anything to make her leave. After it was clear she was gone, his father appeared, begging Edwin for help, saying that he was dying. In a panic, he ran outside screaming for help, but a woman passing by asked what was wrong and what happened to his face. Edwin mentioned what happened and the woman ran inside and called the paramedics. Upon arriving, they announced that his father was dead and then asked him, "What happened to your face?" Moments later, Edwin felt a pressure release from around his forehead and felt cold air on his face for the first time. He likened it to the sound of the peeling of an orange. Everything suddenly became very bright, too bright for Edwin to handle. But the paramedics insisted that they were helping him. After asking Edwin how long that he had an eye injury, he told the paramedics he'd been blind from birth. That's when Edwin realized what had happened. His father had bound his eyes at an early age so that he could not see. After adjusting his vision and joining some online group chats, someone sent him an article explaining everything. It was about his dad and even mentioned Edwin by his name. His father had been stealing girls and keeping them in their basement. The voices that Edwin heard were real girls trying to escape his father. The blinding mask and stories of ghosts were to ensure that Edwin would ignore their cries for help. The article even mentioned 3 names: Ellie Farmer, Alex Riddle, and Sarah.
Hold up. Hey, wait a minute there. Wait a minute there. That man, I think he got what he deserved at some point because that man is a psycho. That man was making his child blind, kidnapping girls, and all kinds of that stuff, and then literally had that for a long time, and literally thought there were ghosts talking to him. Holy.
Ghosts were to ensure that Edwin would ignore their cries for help.
Crazy.
The article even mentioned 3 names: Ellie Farmer, Alex Riddle, and Sarah Frank. Sarah was the one who escaped. She did so by stabbing his father with a knife that he left out to make a sandwich. The only question that Edwin still has to this day that's unanswered is, were the voices that he heard when he spoke to Ellie and Alex before or after his father killed them? Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed these and you want to read the full stories, I encourage you to check out Creepypasta.com, as well as all of the authors who wrote them.
Thank you very much. Oh wait, don't go yet. There's still more. The 5 scariest creepypastas that will keep you up at night, number 2. We're gonna watch them both in one video.
Oh, Uncle Matt's back again to tell you a bedtime story. The stories that come from the mind of a creepypasta writer are often demented, disturbing, and sometimes even beautiful. But ultimately, they result in a feeling of dread, that feeling you get when you know that you're being watched, that something bad is about to happen, or worse. If you're watching this late at night or with the lights off, good. Prepare yourself for some horrific stories that the writers intended to keep you up at night. Here are the 5 scariest creepypastas that will keep you up at night. Number 2. Number 5 is the Seer of Possibilities. Written by Thomas O., he tells the story of a man named Jack, who is contacted by an otherworldly being through his computer monitor. One day while playing solitaire, his screen went black, and red text appeared saying, "Hi Jack, I need a favor from you. You're a very special person, and I know you can help me. I can't ask this of just anyone. I really need your help." Jack, panicking, unplugged the internet from the computer, but the text remained and said, "Still here, Jack." It went on to say how it needed a very specific favor done, how tomorrow Jack was to move a large potted plant next to the elevator at his job 3 inches from the wall, and how he would be rewarded. The text finished with, "I'm asking you because I know you'll do it. You won't let me down. You're special. We'll talk tomorrow." Not knowing what to do, Jack pulled the power cord from the computer and went to bed. The next day, Jack went into work as he always did, but decided since he wasn't doing anything wrong or illegal, he might as well do it and see what happens, and so the plant was moved. Upon seeing nothing else happen, he went upstairs and had his daily chat with his co-worker Allie, whom he had a crush on. However, moments later, his boss James arrived complaining loudly about his twisted ankle from running into the plant in the lobby. The same plant that Jack moved. Panicked, Jack went back to his desk, where there was a message on his computer screen waiting for him. This will all make sense to you in short order. Just go to work tomorrow like you normally do. Don't worry about a thing, Jack. You'll be rewarded. You're special. Talk to you tomorrow. The next day, Jack went to work and everything seemed normal. That was until he heard James approach Allie and ask her to drive him to the hospital for his worsening ankle. It was just moments later that he heard a massive crash. An 18-wheeler crashed into the car, killing Allie and nearly killing James, putting him in a coma. Jack raced home out of fear and was greeted by a message on his computer screen. No, Jack, it's not your fault. I know you're blaming yourself, but all people die eventually, some just sooner than others. The being went on to tell Jack how Allie was indeed interested in him and that they would have dated, however, would have cheated on him, spent all of his money, and made him miserable for 4 long years.
Wait,
Jack,
I didn't hear that part.
Your fault. I know you're blaming yourself, but all people die eventually, some just sooner than others. The being went on to tell Jack how Allie was indeed interested in him and that they would have dated, however, would have cheated on him, spent all of his money, and made him miserable for 4 long years.
Yeah, that's a bad girl.
Jack, in anger, smashed the computer screen and went to bed, not knowing what to do next. The next day at work, he was approached by the head of the company offering him James's job. Jack had been promoted. After going home with the good news, there was yet another message waiting for him. The being revealed itself to be what it called the Seer. It was a being thousands of years old who had a powerful gift to see all futures, all possible outcomes. An artist of human manipulation. That Jack was its paintbrush and canvas, and that together they would make incredible things happen. For the first time, Jack's hesitancy vanished, and Jack simply responded, "What do you want me to do next?" Years passed, and Jack did every favor that the Seer asked. On one occasion, he entered a liquor store where he was instructed to give a man the number 27 when he asked for it. He needed it for a lottery ticket. 2 weeks later, he ran into the same man who had won the lottery. The man cut him a check for $10,000 as a thank you and went about his life. However, Jack was confused as the Seer made it very clear with every favor comes something bad and something good for Jack. But the Seer explained how the man would eventually go broke and his wife would leave him. The next task had Jack park in a specific space at a specific time. That would cause a chain of events that caused a small fender bender, which caused a woman to call her insurance agent, making him leave work late and get mugged, but ultimately leading him to meet Donna, who would become his wife. 12 years passed, and he and the Seer became close. He had a nice job, a nice house, a beautiful wife, and people respected him. He was happy, which is something he never really felt before the Seer contacted him. On one particular day, the Seer gave him a new task. "Hi, Jack, I have a favor to ask you. This one's the easiest yet. You don't even have to get up. Call Riago's Pizza in exactly 2 minutes, let the phone ring 3 times, then you can hang up." So he did, and 30 minutes later, the doorbell rang. He opened the door to a huge 17-year-old kid delivering pizza, which he insisted Jack take, despite Jack telling him he didn't order it, but it was paid for, so he took it. Unfortunately, he didn't have money for a tip, so the boy, after looking briefly inside the house, walked away angrily. After handing the pizza to his wife, who was sitting on the couch, he went into his office where another message was waiting. But Jack was not ready for what it had to say. The Seer explained how it's true he never lied to Jack, but he did withhold certain information. Allie was helping her brother through college to be a great psychologist, but he had to drop out after she died. The pizza delivery boy could have used that psychologist. The lottery winner was the neighbor to the pizza delivery boy, and after losing all of his money, beat him senseless as a boy after he jumped into the street in front of his car, traumatizing him. The boy's mother couldn't protect him because she was high on drugs given to her by her boyfriend, who bought the drugs with the money he stole from the insurance agent. Jack, you've done over 100 tasks for me, and each one has served an ultimate purpose: to psychologically destroy this boy, turn him into a monster, and to bring him here tonight. Together, we've done something wonderful. This is a masterpiece of human manipulation, our masterpiece. It began and ends with you, Jack. Tonight, wrong address, no tip, this poor boy finally snapped. He's downstairs right now. He's slitting Donna's throat at this exact moment. Jack could hear a short, muffled scream coming from the living room, followed by a gurgling noise. Do you know what, Jack? If I'd never contacted you, you would have lived for 85 years. 85 boring, meaningless, and bitter years. And when you died, nobody would have been at your funeral. I gave you 12 great, meaningful years. You were happy, and together we did something beautiful, something unique. And just then, behind Jack, the massive hulk of the demented delivery boy appeared in the doorway, a bloody knife in hand. On the screen, the last words from the seer appeared. Do you have something to say to me, Jack? Jack wiped his final tears and simply said, thank you. Number 4 is Don't Let Them In. Written by Maddie Kate, she tells the story of two girls, Emily and Annie, with an addiction-riddled mother. The story starts with the memories of Emily, then 7, who recalls her mother's back teeth falling out, and how she kept them, hoping one day that she could put her back together. Annie mostly took care of Emily, as their mother was often incapacitated, putting on band-aids, making her microwave meals, and even brushing her hair. They lived in a dilapidated home that was falling apart, with water-damaged ceilings, rusted appliances, and rotted stairs.
That's bad.
When their mother would use lightly, everything was mostly fine, and would even make them pancakes and take trips to the beach with them. But unfortunately, those days were rare, as the majority of the time she'd use heavily, would be out all night, and leave them for days without food, and even come home with random men. On Emily's 13th birthday in October, her mom had been gone for days and called her to wish her a happy birthday, to which Emily promptly hung up the phone on her. But what was worse was Annie's reaction. Annie was becoming like her mother. On that Wednesday night, Annie kept falling drunk off of whiskey at the age of 16, laughing hysterically like her mother did. Things didn't seem like they could get worse, that is, until the next day. The two sisters, angry with each other, were washing dishes together when they first heard it, the faint sound like that of crying coming from the backyard. They assumed that it was Milka, the 2-year-old next door, and so ignored it. It was now night, and they went outside on the porch to enjoy the sky, when they were interrupted by a wailing so terrible it didn't even sound human. In the bushes by the back fence, someone was crouching with their knees tucked up neatly under their chin, their arms wrapped around their legs, mouth agape, softly opening and closing as they cried. They ran inside out of terror in order to call the police, forgetting that they left their phone on the porch when they heard it, a tapping at the window. Someone or something's forehead was slowly and repeatedly bumping the glass. A moment later, it stopped, until suddenly, the thing smashed its head right through the window. The sisters ran up the stairs and locked themselves in the bathroom. The thing was now inside the house, and it was looking for them. Annie decided bravely that she was going to go for help. When I go, I need you to lock the door, and I don't want you to open it for anything or anyone. Not for me, not for anyone. Promise me, she said. And with that, Annie flew open the door and was gone into the dark hallway. Emily bolted the door shut just in time for something to bounce off the outside of the door with a high-pitched scream. "Em?" the voice asked. The voice was that of her mother. "Sweetie, it's okay, just open the door. It's okay, just let me in," it said. Then suddenly she heard her sister. "Emily, let us in." The voices grew louder and louder, the banging on the door getting more and more intense, as if the door would break open at any moment. Suddenly, all went quiet. That's when the door shot open. Arms lifted Emily up and took her outside. She was surrounded by police cars and ambulances, and there was her sister in the middle of it all, Annie, with a smile on her face. As it turns out, there was no demon. It was actually her mom, out of her mind on booze, drugs, and everything in between, coming to the end of a week-long binge. Something had finally broken inside of her head, and this time there was no putting her back together. She'd been so high that she was able to mimic Annie's voice nearly perfectly. The real monsters are the ones that eat you alive slowly, the kind that comes in a bottle or a needle, or at the end of a long list of reasons why you can't get out of bed in the morning. Sometimes the monsters are the ones that raise you or love you the most, but it's up to you to let them in. Number 3 is A Shattered Life.
Makes sense.
Written by Matt Demirsky, the story opens with a man telling us that he'd been attacked by an entity that he cannot describe. It felt like claws puncturing his very soul, while his body remained completely intact. From that point forward, he began feeling fatigued and vaguely tired. For a while, he was able to ward off the subtle drain with copious amounts of coffee, which seemed to help. As time went on, he met his love, Marjorie, and their love was able to keep the entity at bay, but only for a time. That's when the incidents began. They began minor, with him noticing his neighbor's car had changed color, or that his co-workers' names had changed. But then, big leaps in memory began happening. One day, Marjorie came to his house with a key and boxes. She was about to move in. Last he remembered, they had just met a week ago, but in order to sound sane, he kept his mouth shut. The entity had eaten 3 months of his life. After that, for 3 full years, he never once let himself zone out. He stayed completely aware at all times. That was until one day when he grew a little careless. Suddenly, a young boy was tugging on his arm that he didn't recognize. It was his son. He knew immediately what had happened. He had missed the birth of his son. The entity had, this time, eaten a much larger portion of his memory. It was at that point that he had had enough. He went to doctors and priests. Nothing. Nobody could determine what was happening or the cause, and some didn't even believe him. However, that's when things changed. One night, Marjorie arrived in a nice dress at his home. Oddly, she had knocked this time. It was their second date. The entity had not been eating his memories, but instead had shattered his soul. He was experiencing his life in fragments and out of order. And so time went on. Changes in politics or geography would happen daily, and major changes would occur every couple months.
I know what that phone said.
This time,
I know what that phone said.
it was their second date.
I know exactly what that phone said.
The entity had not been eating his memories, but instead had
phone
shattered his soul. He was experiencing his life in fragments and out of order. And so time went on. Changes in politics.
Cases, there were now more than 3,000 cases of coronavirus, so I'm guessing this is pretty new.
Geography would happen daily, and major changes would occur every couple months. And it was getting worse. One day he was suddenly in the presence of another young boy. It was his grandson. The entity had burrowed deep into his psyche, and major shifts like this began happening every couple weeks, not months. He became terrified that before long, these changes would be as frequent as his own heartbeats. That's when he suddenly found himself at a window, watching the snowfall. His grandson, now a teenager, approached him, and for the first time, he told someone about his fragmented consciousness. Surprisingly, the teen offered to help to map his psychic wound, and for the first time, he felt hope. They came up with the idea to write down everything that he could and keep them in boxes under the stairs. And just like that, suddenly he was young again and was beginning to write what would become 50 boxes of memories over his lifetime. Then in a blink, he was as old as he had ever been. His grandson was now in his 30s. He took him to a room filled with strange equipment and sat him in a rubber chair facing a large mirror twice the height of a man. The pattern finally revealed itself, the grandson said. Turning on the machine, an electric zap created an arc above his head, just enough to reveal what this creature was, a parasite. A bulging leech-like mouth was wrapped around the back of his head, coming down to his eyebrows and touching his ear, with a slug-like body running over his shoulder and into his very soul. It was feeding on his mind. His grandson discovered after 2 decades of research, the entity came from another dimension and feeds on the plexus of mind, soul, and quantum consciousness reality. They decided to use the machine, and in a painful whirl, the electroshock with pain greater than anything he'd ever felt before flowed through his ears. Suddenly, his memories flared. He could see the birth of his son. He could see the death of his wife Marjorie and everything else that he had missed. His scream faded, as did the machine, electricity, and chair, and he was now out in the woods on a bright summer day. But there it was. The creature was there, and it approached him. But this time it hissed and turned away. His grandson had done it. He'd become an unappetizing meal to the entity and returned home in a daze. He knew how his life would turn out. He knew every painful and beautiful experience that was coming, but he didn't care. He was back. And this realization was only interrupted by a single phone call. The same one he got that introduced him to her. It was Marjorie. Number 2 is If You're Armed at the Glenmont Metro, Please Shoot Me. Written by Peter Frost David, the author tells the story of a man who's begging you to end his life. As the man explains, his ordeal started over 10,000 years ago. He earned money by participating in drug trials. On one particular morning, they gave him a drug that was a psychoactive substance intended to accelerate brain function, and it worked. They sent him into the waiting room after he took it, where he read a copy of US News and Scientific American cover to cover in no time. He read 3 magazines in 8 minutes. He then picked out a copy of Moby Dick, but just reaching one foot in front of the other felt like it took a long time. Exhausted, he collapsed into the couch in what seemed like a slow-motion fall in a movie. When they called him back in, he explained that he felt slow, but the truth was the other way around. Everything seemed slow because his brain was so fast. His brain was now functioning 10 to 20 times the normal speed, so even walking and moving his legs seemed excruciatingly slow. As they ran tests on him, his mind was off the charts. He finished a 50-word search in 3 seconds. He solved an intricate maze in 2 seconds. He was able to view a slideshow projected at 10 images a second and answered 95% correct as to what he saw.
That's like
Ultimately,
robot
they sent
speed.
him home, telling him that it would wear off in a couple hours. But the ride home was horrible. 3 metro stops only actually took 35 minutes, but in his drug-induced hypertime, it felt like days. When he got home, the elevator ride up felt like 5 hours just to move 7 floors. He picked up books he was reading and finished it almost instantly. Most of the time, he spent just turning the actual pages. He couldn't even surf the web because his high-speed internet seemed to take forever, so he decided to sleep it off. But it would not come. He decided to take an Ambien, and it took hours just to swallow it, but ultimately, nothing. It was torture. Unable to sleep, he decided to go back to the office to get them to fix this, and ran outside. That is when everything stopped all at once. After the Ambien took effect, time moved thousands of times slower. Every second became days. He rolled his ankle by accident as his high-speed mind was completely unable to control his low-speed body. The pain increased over what felt like days, undiluted by the change in his perception of time. That was when he decided to end it all, to throw himself in front of a train. Crawling off the escalator, minutes felt like years. Then it happened. It fully hit him while he was curled up by the bench. He blinked, and years of darkness followed. Sound was gone, and now so was sight. All that existed was the pain from the fall. Trying to pull out his phone took decades. And so this story was his final attempt at help. He's lived hundreds of lifespans at the foot of the Metro bench. He became far older in spirit than any human who had ever lived. Most of that experience a snapshot of pain huddled on the floor of a subway platform. He spent lifetimes typing and posting this exact message in a hope that someone will hear it and become convinced that his suffering must end. Anyone on that platform. Someone who will find a man curled under a bench, the man who crawled down the escalator, and kill him as swiftly as possible. His only ask, if you're armed and at the Glenmont Metro, please shoot me. And number 1 is What Happens When the Stars Go Out. Written by Jesse Clark, he tells the story of a young man named Brian slipping in and out of memories after making a life-ending decision. Brian finds himself on a gurney surrounded by EMTs who are trying to save his life. He loses consciousness and is transported back to a memory of being at an exhibit in a museum. A girl approaches him and strikes up a conversation about how everyone is made up of stars and introduces herself as Robin. Brian, he responds, and the two go for drinks. Instantly, he's transported back to an ambulance where 2 EMTs are arguing over him. One EMT, Todd, has given up. "This one's gone, Rachel," he says, while Rachel, the other EMT, says she's not losing another one tonight. Brian flashes back and forth between these kind of memories. Memories of being with Robin on a Ferris wheel and other places, just being in love with Robin. They're beautiful memories, but something feels wrong. Everything is getting hotter and hotter. He flashes back and forth between that and the ambulance until he remembers one significant, utterly sad moment with Robin. It was a rainy day and the two were having a conversation about their future when Brian begins talking about the divorce rate, how he wants to make sure that she's the one, and how sometimes it's impossible to know. Immediately he realizes the mistake that he's made, but it's too late. Robin, heartbroken, asks to be dropped off at her car. As the rain is pouring down on them, Robin asks him where he sees them going, and although Brian tries to explain, it's too late. She reveals a ring that she explained was her mother's. How she knew that Brian was the one and how she wanted to spend her life with him, but now it's over. She gets in her Honda Civic and drives off. Brian decides that he can make this right, goes to the store to buy flowers, and speeds after her in the rain. But Brian is stopped by a police officer up ahead, telling him that there's an accident, a bad one. Up ahead, Brian could see a man on the side of the road, with his head in his hands, SUV totaled. But amongst the wreckage, Brian could clearly make out one other thing, the other car. It was a Civic. Brian knew immediately what had happened. He got out of his car and ran towards the crash, screaming, "That's my girl, that's my girl," and was stopped by the officer, but not before he saw it, the white sheet on the gurney. Just then, in a blink, he flashes back to being with the EMTs, this time in a hospital, the unexplainable heat intensifying. He can feel tubes in his throat and a black substance being forced down it, charcoal.